They escaped the most secure place on Earth in 1942. December 16, 1942, San Francisco Bay. The water temperature, a bone-chilling 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The current, violent enough to drag a grown man under in seconds. The distance to shore, 1.5 miles of churning darkness. And somewhere in that frozen hell, 5 desperate men were swimming for their freedom. What you're about to hear is the true story of the only successful escape from Alcatraz Island during World War II, a breakout so audacious, so meticulously planned, that it would haunt the prison's warden for the rest of his life. This is the story of men who refuse to accept the impossible. But first, you need to understand what Alcatraz really was. They called it the Rock, and it wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary sat like a concrete crown on a 22-acre island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. It held America's most dangerous criminals, bank robbers, kidnappers, murderers, men who had proven they couldn't be held anywhere else. The prison opened in 1934 with one simple promise: escape is impossible. And for 8 years, that promise held true. The island was surrounded by water so cold it could kill you in 15 minutes. The currents were treacherous, unpredictable whirlpools that had claimed dozens of lives over the decades. Even if you made it past the guard towers, past the searchlights that swept the shores every 30 seconds, past the barbed wire and the armed patrols, you still had to survive the bay. The prison officials loved to tell new inmates about the bodies that washed up on shore, bloated, blue, frozen in their final moments of panic. "You can try to escape," the guards would say with cold smiles. "The sharks in the cold will bring you back." But 5 men weren't listening. Their names were Joseph Kretzer, Arnold Kyle, Sam Shockley, Lloyd Barkdahl, and Fred Hunter. These weren't petty criminals. These were men who had spent their entire lives fighting the system. Men who saw bars and walls not as endings, but as challenges. Joseph Kretzer was the ringleader, a career bank robber with ice in his veins and a brilliant criminal mind. He'd already escaped from McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary once before. Alcatraz was supposed to break men like him. Instead, it only sharpened his resolve. Arnold Kyle was the muscle, a kidnapper with a violent streak and nothing left to lose. He'd been sentenced to life, and those words had hollowed him out, made him dangerous in ways that even the guards surprised. Sam Shockley was unpredictable, mentally unstable, prone to outbursts but fiercely loyal. The other inmates called him Crazy Sam, and he wore the name like armor. Lloyd Barkdahl and Fred Hunter were the followers, men desperate enough to bet their lives on someone else's plan. Together, they were a powder keg waiting for a spark. And in the spring of 1942, Kretzer provided that spark with 3 words: "We're getting out." Now, here's what makes this escape extraordinary. They didn't tunnel, they didn't forge keys, they didn't have outside help. They did something far more audacious. They walked out the front door. Well, almost. Kretzer's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. During work detail in the Prison Industries building, they would overpower a guard, steal his uniform and keys, then pose as correctional officers escorting inmates back to the main cell house. Once inside, they'd raid the armory, take hostages, and commandeer one of the prison boats docked at the island's pier. It was bold. It was insane. It was their only chance. For months, they watched. They studied the guards' routines, memorizing every moment of vulnerability. They observed the boat schedule, noting when vessels arrived and departed. They learned which guards were careless, which ones could be intimidated, which ones would fight back. Kretzer had a rule: no unnecessary violence. They'd take hostages if needed, but killing would bring the full weight of the federal government down on them. This had to be surgical, precise. But prison escapes, like all perfect plans, never survive contact with reality. The morning started like any other. Fog rolled across the bay in thick gray waves. The horn from passing ships echoed across the water. Inside Alcatraz, 260 inmates shuffled through their morning routines. Breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments, the endless monotony that defined prison life. But for 5 men, this was the day everything changed. They moved to their positions in the prison industries building. Kretzer gave the signal, a subtle nod, nothing more. Then, all hell broke loose. They rushed Officer Royal C. Klein, slamming him against a workbench before he could react. Kyle pressed a makeshift knife against the guard's throat. "Don't make a sound," Kretzer hissed, "or you're dead." For Officer Klein, time stopped. He was a 42-year-old man with a wife and 2 children waiting for him back in San Francisco. He'd worked at Alcatraz for 3 years, always professional, always by the book. And now his life hung in the balance depended on the mercy of men who had none. The inmates stripped him of his uniform, his keys, his dignity. Kretzer slipped into the officer's jacket. It didn't fit perfectly, he was taller than Klein, but in the chaos of the prison, it might be enough. "Move," he ordered the others. They tied Klein up and locked him in a storage closet. If everything went according to plan, he'd be found in an hour, shaken but alive. If things went wrong, well, they didn't try to think about that. Here's what the official prison report would later say. At approximately 1:40 p.m., 5 inmates from the Industries building failed to return from work detail. A head count revealed, but reports can't capture the terror that ripped through Alcatraz that afternoon. Sirens screamed, guards sprinted across catwalks, boots hammering metal. The tower guards swiveled their searchlights, cutting through the fog, hunting for shadows. Locked down, 5 inmates missing. The prison descended into controlled chaos. Every cell block sealed, every inmate accounted for, every guard armed and searching. But Kretzer and his crew were already gone. They'd made it past the first checkpoint by showing Klein's keys to an inexperienced guard who didn't look closely enough at faces. They'd navigated through the prison industries area, moving with purpose, looking like they belonged. And then they reached the final barrier, the door to the dock area. That's when the plans started to crumble. The dock guard, Officer Ernest Legason, was a 15-year veteran of Alcatraz. He'd seen every trick, every scam, and something about the group approaching him set off alarm bells in his head. "Hold on," he said, hand moving towards his baton. "Show me those." Kretzer didn't give him the chance. He lunged forward, and the 5 inmates swarmed the guard like wolves. The fight was brutal and brief. Legason was tough, but he was one man against 5 desperate prisoners. They beat him down, took his weapon, and left him bleeding on the concrete. Now, there was no going back. They'd crossed the line from escape to assault. Federal charges would pile up like bodies. If they were caught, life sentences would become death sentences. So, they ran. The fog was their ally and their enemy. It concealed them from the guard towers, but also hid the treacherous rocks along the shore. They scrambled down the embankment, sliding on loose gravel, the icy wind cutting through their thin prison uniforms. And then they reached the water. Imagine that moment. 5 men staring at the churning black water of San Francisco Bay, the mainland glimmering in the distance, so close and yet impossibly far. Behind them, sirens and searchlights and armed guards closing in. Before them, almost certain death. Joseph Kretzer looked at his companions. He saw fear in their eyes. Hell, he felt it himself, that primal terror that makes your hands shake and your stomach clench. We go now or we die here. No debate, no hesitation. They plunged into the water. The cold hit them like a physical blow, knocking the air from their lungs. The current immediately grabbed at them, trying to drag them under, out to the Pacific Ocean where they'd never be found. They kicked, they swam, they fought against the water with every ounce of strength they possessed. Behind them, searchlights finally found the shoreline. Alarm bells rang across the island. Guards rushed to the water's edge, rifles raised. "Halt! Halt, or we'll shoot!" But they were already ghosts in the fog, swallowed by the bay. Now, here's where the story takes a turn you might not expect. The official report from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, filed December 17, 1942, states clearly, all 5 inmates presumed drowned, bodies not recovered, case closed. The warden, James A. Johnston, held a press conference 3 days later. He stood before reporters with his jaw set, his eyes hard, and declared with absolute certainty, "No one escapes Alcatraz. These men died in the bay. Their bodies will wash up eventually, as all bodies do." The newspapers ran the story. Alcatraz escape attempt ends in death. The public accepted it. The case file was stamped and archived. But some of the guards who were there that night, they weren't so sure. Officer William Miller, who was stationed in the West Tower, later told his family a different story. He said that he saw something in the fog that night, shapes moving through the water with purpose, with determination. He said he watched them get further from the island, not pulled under by the current, but fighting against it, successfully. So, what really happened to Joseph Kretzer, Arnold Kyle, Sam Shockley, Lloyd Barkdahl, and Fred Hunter? The official answer, they drowned. But here's the uncomfortable truth that the Bureau of Prisons didn't want to admit. Their bodies were never found, not one, not ever. In San Francisco Bay, bodies always surface. The currents are predictable enough that the Coast Guard has maps showing exactly where drowning victims wash up. The prison officials knew this. The guards knew this. For years afterward, there were reported sightings. A man matching Joseph Kretzer's description was allegedly seen in Mexico in 1944. Arnold Kyle's sister claimed she received an unsigned letter with details only her brother would know. Fred Hunter's childhood neighbor swore he saw him on a street in Los Angeles in 1947, older, thinner, but unmistakably alive. Were these sightings real? Were they wishful thinking? Shared delusions? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is this. The escape on December 16, 1942, terrified the administration at Alcatraz. It exposed vulnerabilities they'd claimed didn't exist. It shattered the myth of the inescapable prison. And it inspired something far more significant. In 1962, exactly 20 years after Kretzer's escape, 3 inmates named Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin pulled off what would become the most famous prison break in American history. They dug through the walls of their cells, climbed through ventilation shafts, and vanished into the same fog-shrouded bay. Their bodies were never found either. When investigators studied that 1962 escape, they found something interesting in the prison archives: detailed notes about the 1942 attempt, diagrams, patrol schedules, guard rotations. The Anglin brothers and Frank Morris had learned from Kretzer's escape. They'd studied what went right and what went wrong. They'd built upon his plan, refined it, perfected it. And here's the part that should give you chills. In 2013, San Francisco police received a letter. It was allegedly written by John Anglin, one of the 1962 escapees. In it, he claimed that all 3 men had survived the escape, that they'd lived for decades in hiding. At the end of the letter, he wrote something curious. "We weren't the first ones out. A man named Kretzer showed us it could be done." The FBI investigated the letter. They determined it was likely authentic. So let me ask you a question. What do you believe? Do you believe 5 desperate men drowned in the black waters of San Francisco Bay on that December night in 1942? That the currents took them under and the cold stopped their hearts? Or do you believe that somewhere, in Mexico, in Canada, living under assumed names in small towns across America, those 5 men found the freedom they were willing to die for? The truth is, it doesn't really matter. Because what Joseph Kretzer and his crew accomplished wasn't just an escape, it was something far more powerful. They shattered the myth of Alcatraz. They proved that walls and guards and cold water weren't enough to contain the human desire for freedom. They showed that even in the most secure place on Earth, hope could survive. Warden James A. Johnston resigned in 1948, 6 years after the escape. In his private journals, unsealed decades after his death, he wrote a single line about December 16, 1942. Perhaps they made it all after all. God help us if they did. Alcatraz closed its doors in 1963. The Bureau of Prisons claimed it was due to maintenance costs, but those who worked there knew the truth. The rock had been broken, not by hammer and chisel, but by the unwavering determination of men who refused to be caged. Today, Alcatraz is a tourist attraction. Millions visit each year, walking through empty cell blocks, imagining what life was like for the inmates who called it home. And if you visit on a foggy December evening when the wind howls across the bay and the water churns black and cold, stand on the shore where Kretzer and his crew made their desperate leap. Close your eyes and listen. You might just hear the ghosts of 5 men still swimming towards freedom. The files remain open, the case unsolved, the question unanswered. Did they escape the most secure place on Earth? Or did the bay claim them, as it has claimed so many others? The answer might be out there, somewhere in the fog, waiting to be discovered.